Film lover has that one director who changed everything, whose images and sounds shaped who we became. For me, no filmmaker has ever haunted my imagination more profoundly than John Carpenter. From the moment I started this channel, this is the project I always wanted to make. But how do you capture a filmmaker's life's work, one movie at a time, one haunting score after another? Or maybe you simply gather every film, every note, every story until somewhere in between you catch a glimpse of the mind behind it all. Begin. John Howard Carpenter was born on January 16, 1948 in Carthage, New York, a small Irish Catholic paper mill town near the Canadian border. But his real childhood took shape nearly 1,000 miles away in Bowling Green, Kentucky, where his family moved when he was 5 years old. It was a quiet tobacco farming community, beautiful, deeply religious, and harshly divided along racial lines. The Carpenter family lived in a little log cabin rented by his father behind the Kentucky Museum. They were outsiders who never quite belonged, Yankees in the Bible Belt. In Bowling Green, Carpenter grew up isolated, feeling unsafe everywhere except at home. He perceived the hatred and discrimination around him as something otherworldly, later recalling, "Everything I know about evil I learned in that little town." Movies became his escape. The characters on the screen felt closer to him than anyone around town. The first film he ever saw was John Huston's The African Queen, sitting beside his mother Milton Jean in the Capitol Theatre downtown. He was too young to fully understand, but mesmerized nonetheless. Soon he discovered films like It Came From Outer Space, Forbidden Planet, and the thrilling horrors of Hammer films. These early cinematic encounters awoke something inside him, the power of fear and the addictive sensation of being frightened. Good and evil felt intertwined, both in his town and the movies he loved. He began to realize that men could simultaneously be both saints and demons. His mother gave him the gift of both fantasy and sanity, while his father Howard, a music professor and a workaholic, instilled in him a mandate to question everything, filling their home with constant music. John learned violin, bass, and guitar, eventually playing in a local band called Kaleidoscope, performing covers of popular hits. Carpenter was deeply creative from a young age. Shy, reserved, yet sharp-witted, he wrote short stories and poetry, drew comics, acted in school plays, and by 1965 was publishing sci-fi and horror fanzines with titles like Fantastic Films, King Kong Journal, and Phantasm. His most important childhood friendship was with Tommy Lee Wallace, who would become a lifelong friend and collaborator. Then his father gave him a gift that would change everything, an 8mm film camera accompanied by the blunt advice, "Go create something instead of just sitting here with your thumb up your ass." Carpenter took that camera and immediately started making short monster movies in his backyard, inspired by the classic creature features he adored. He later described these early efforts as devastatingly bad, never wanting anyone else to see them. Yet filmmaking quickly evolved from passion to obsession and finally into compulsion. Soon he couldn't imagine doing anything else. But Carpenter never intended to settle for short films. He aspired to make full-length features. His first serious attempts, Revenge of the Colossal Beasts and The Warrior and the Demon, were ambitious 40-minute films, heavily influenced by Hollywood yet already infused with his distinctive vision. Increasingly fascinated by filmmaking itself, Carpenter admired films by directors like Roger Corman, John Ford, and especially Howard Hawks. It was Hawks' Rio Bravo in 1959 that opened his eyes to directing. Carpenter watched the film every weekend it played at the Capitol Theatre, and one day standing before the movie's poster he wondered, Who is Howard Hawks? He didn't write the movie, he didn't act in it. Why is his name written in such large letters? This realization defined Carpenter's future. He finally understood what directing actually meant. By 1968, Carpenter was 2 years into studies at the University of Western Kentucky. Life was comfortable. He was playing music, meeting girls, and earning some money. Things were easy, but the urge to direct was growing unbearable. He faced a crossroads: stay here and embrace the comfort, or risk everything for a dream. So Carpenter packed his bags, left Bowling Green behind, and moved west to Los Angeles, enrolling in the USC School of Cinematic Arts. He was determined to give filmmaking a genuine shot. Howard Hawks didn't just direct movies, he shaped the way Carpenter saw cinema itself. His films had a rhythm, a directness, a sense of unshakable confidence. Hawks showed Carpenter that good storytelling doesn't need to be flashy, it needs to be clear, honest, and most of all, efficient. In Hawks, Carpenter found more than a favorite filmmaker. He found a blueprint for everything he wanted to be. In 1968, John Carpenter left Bowling Green behind and headed west towards a dream. He enrolled at the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts, one of the few serious film programs in the country at the time. USC didn't just teach filmmaking, it launched his adult life, it opened him up. Carpenter arrived at exactly the right moment when making films was finally seen as something worth studying. He would later say that 75% of everything he knew about filmmaking came from USC. The school had deep living ties to Hollywood. Directors, writers, and producers would regularly visit, not just to teach but to talk. Carpenter sat in lectures and retrospectives led by the legends themselves: Howard Hawks, Orson Welles, John Ford, Alfred Hitchcock, Frank Capra, learning from the masters firsthand. When I was in school, they once taught us the most thermodynamically efficient way to cool a six-pack in a fridge. I should have picked a different field. Still, we apply the lessons the best we can, I guess. At USC, filmmaking was brutal by design. Students had to make a new short film every 2 weeks. No excuses. Every student had to rotate through every role, behind the camera, writing scripts, editing footage, and even acting. And Carpenter hated acting. He also despised the dense technical lectures about f-stops and kelvins, what he called all that scientific crap, but he learned to master it anyway and later realized how important it all was, because understanding the science gave him something far more important: control. It was here in the pressure cooker of USC that Carpenter forged the tools that would define his entire career: precision editing, sound as atmosphere, camera movement as storytelling. He believed that a small team working together with trust could accomplish more than a giant studio machine. And along the way he found his people, fellow students like Nick Castle and Dan O'Bannon, friends who shared the same hunger, the same love of science fiction and horror, and the same drive to get things done. The first real proof of what they could do came with a short film called The Resurrection of Bronco Billy. Inspired by Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in the West, it was made by a four-man crew: Carpenter, Castle, and 2 others. There was no formal director, they directed it together. Carpenter co-wrote, edited, composed the music, and handled the lighting, while Nick Castle worked behind the camera. They scraped together $2,000 or $3,000 out of their own pockets, no help from the school. The result?
And the winner is... The winner is The Resurrection of Bronco Billy, John Longman.
And for the filmmakers, we're all very grateful. Jim Rokos, Nick Castle, and John Carpenter. Right now, I don't feel too bad about getting a B.
The industry noticed, even if USC tried to take much of the credit. Carpenter wasn't at the ceremony to receive it. USC showed them the Oscar from a paper bag. briefly, but they never even reimbursed the students, never offered credit where it was fully due. Carpenter thought no art school would claim they own your paintings, so how dare you? At USC, Carpenter didn't just find collaborators, he found a creative family. Tommy Lee Wallace had been a childhood friend, Nick Castle became a new one. Together they forged partnerships built on pressure, passion and small budgets, bonds that would carry through some of Carpenter's most important films. They trusted each other. And in a business that would only get tougher, that trust would become one of Carpenter's greatest assets. After the resurrection of Bronco Billy, Carpenter knew one thing for sure. The next film he made, he would own it. No studio, no school, no compromises. That project became Dark Star. It began in 1970 as a student project between Carpenter and Dan O'Bannon, originally titled The Electric Dutchman, then briefly renamed Planetfall. It was envisioned as Waiting for Godot in space, absurd, existential, and very, very cheap. Like a depressed 2001 A Space Odyssey, Carpenter and O'Bannon wanted to show space travel not as heroic but as empty, lonely, and meaningless. A crew adrift in space, blowing up rogue planets and creating supernovas, yet feeling nothing at all. No matter how advanced humanity becomes, the film suggests, we remain prisoners of the human condition, incapable of transcending boredom. No epic classical score, no profound cosmic purpose, just a twangy country song drifting across the void, punctuated by malfunctioning equipment and meaningless transmissions. The production was almost as absurd as the story they were telling. The sets were assembled from styrofoam scraps, salvaged knobs, and whatever machine parts they could scavenge from trash cans. The cast was made up mostly of fellow USC students whom Carpenter had to plead again and again to return for reshoots. On occasion, some arrived stone out of their mind on LSD. It was that kind of time. Filming took place in rented basements, garages and low-rent sound stages, with only about 10% actually shot on the USC campus. The alien, if you could call it that, was a spray-painted beach ball with plastic claws, animated by Nick Castle crouched behind it. It took 4 years to complete a 45-minute cut, and even then they were stuck. Too long to be a short, too short to be a feature. Enter Jack H. Harris, a Hollywood bargain-hunting or bottom-feeding producer better known for distributing adult and R-rated films, saw strange potential in Dark Star. He agreed to distribute it but demanded reshoots, re-edits and new scenes. Despite Carpenter's and O'Bannon's open disdain for him, Harris helped them to raise the total budget to around $60,000. Tensions on set weren't limited to Harris. Carpenter's friendship with Dan O'Bannon also began to fracture. Carpenter accused O'Bannon for taking credit for their shared ideas. O'Bannon, in turn, felt Carpenter treated him as expendable, something to be used then discarded. Both men wanted to direct, and as Carpenter later put it, the last thing a director needs is another guy who wants to be a director. Their feud would outlast the production of Dark Star by quite some time. But still, somehow Dark Star was complete. The final cut ran 83 minutes. And yet, buried under all that duct tape and beach balls, real talent shined through. Carpenter's instinct for timing, pacing and atmosphere was already unmistakable. Long silences, deadpan humor, minimalist design, trademarks that would define his work for decades. After 6 years in the USC, he felt he had learned what he needed to, took Dark Star with him, and dropped out. The film was well received by science fiction critics and underground film circles, even if regular audiences didn't quite know what to make of it. Even Roger Ebert praised its ingenuity and dry wit. Financially though, it was a failure. Carpenter and O'Bannon were each paid about $5,000 for almost 5 years of work. After Dark Star, Carpenter expected the offers to roll in. They didn't. No studios called, no doors opened. Instead, he found himself in a familiar place, struggling. Supported financially by his father, Carpenter sank into a quiet period of depression, a harsh reminder that even finishing a feature film didn't guarantee anything in Hollywood. To scrape by, he was briefly employed as an editor of an adult entertainment movie called The Last Foxtrot in Burbank. I would love to review it for you guys, but it's unfortunately lost media. Carpenter began cranking out screenplays, not out of passion for writing, but out of necessity. Writing wasn't the dream, it was a job. Directing was the dream. During this period, he wrote screenplays like Blood River and Black Moon Rising. He also started outlining a story about a dystopian future, something he called Escape from New York. That one would have to wait, however. Jack H. Harris, the same Hollywood hustler Carpenter had clashed with during Dark Star, showed interest in Carpenter's screenplay called Eyes. Columbia Pictures wanted something thrilling and glamorous for Barbra Streisand, and Carpenter was hired to adapt the screenplay for her. It came with a real paycheck, $20,000. But Carpenter didn't know New York. He struggled. The studio doubted his ability to deliver, and he doubted himself. Eventually, other writers were brought in to reshape the script. Streisand dropped out, and Faye Dunaway took over the lead. Carpenter hated the final film. It wasn't his anymore. But later on, when Eyes of Laura Mars finally hit theaters in 1978 as an $8 million production, his name was still in the credits. And in Hollywood, credit meant survival. Meanwhile, Carpenter set out to make a second independent feature, but this time it would be entirely on his own terms. At first, he wanted to make a western, a classic Howard Hawks-style story like Rio Bravo or El Dorado, but there was no money for horses or period costumes, so he adapted. Instead of cowboys and Indians, it would be cops and robbers. Backing came from the CKK Corporation, a small Philadelphia company that was willing to finance the project as long as he stayed within budgets. Originally, they intended to finance 2 ultra-low budget films, but after reading Carpenter's script, they decided to bet everything, $100,000, on this one project. And most importantly, they gave him something Carpenter valued more than money: total creative freedom. The project that was originally titled The Anderson Alamo, then The Siege, became Assault on Precinct 13. Carpenter would write, direct, edit, and compose the score himself. He poured everything he had into making Assault feel like a real movie. Instead of adapting the film to the budget, Carpenter insisted on the best. He rented a Panavision camera, got MGM Color Labs for the processing, Samuel Goldwyn sound for the audio, and he compromised on everything else. Some of the crew accused him of exploiting the cast, as there was barely anything left for salaries, and they were probably right. But when the first dailies were projected onto a bedsheet in their crummy office, jaws dropped. It looked unmistakably like a real movie. The cast also quietly planted seeds for the future. Charles Cyphers and Nancy Loomis made early appearances, both actors who would return again and again in Carpenter's films. The final day of shooting was brutal, a 24-hour marathon. His editing sessions went on late into the night. He was joined by Tommy Lee Wallace and Deborah Hill, who would soon become one of Carpenter's most important collaborators. Their relationship quickly became romantic, and after the production was over, they moved in together. The story Carpenter built wasn't about action for action's sake. It was about trust, mutual respect, men and women thrown together under siege, learning to rely on each other. It was pure Howard Hawks, filtered through Carpenter's emerging voice. The influences ran deep, the endless human wave of attackers borrowed from the Night of the Living Dead, the cool laconic dialogue of Hawksian heroes, the casual blending of genres, crime, action, western, without apology. At the center stood the relationship between Lieutenant Bishop and the convict Napoleon Wilson. Wilson, dangerous, sarcastic, unknowable, was written specifically for Carpenter's friend and neighbor Darwin Joston. He would become the first prototype of Carpenter's future antiheroes, a shadow of Snake Plissken waiting to be born.
Gotta smoke.
But Assault wasn't without controversy. Carpenter included a shocking scene, a young girl gunned down in cold blood. The MPAA demanded the scene to be cut. Carpenter hated censorship, but he played the game. He trimmed the version sent to the censors and left it untouched in every other copy. Sneaky. If Dark Star had been a portrait of existential despair, Assault, as grim as it was, carried a flicker of optimism. That even surrounded by chaos and violence, trust could still be earned, courage could still matter. I really like this movie. Even if Dark Star started it all, I always feel this is the first true John Carpenter film. While funnily enough there is no Precinct 13 in the movie, all the elements that made his movies great are readily on display. When the film finally opened in America, it barely made a sound, but in Europe, especially in UK and France, it was a sensation. Critics hailed it as a near-perfect genre film, festivals gave it awards, audiences in London recognized something Hollywood had missed, a sharp new filmmaker. And then, for the first time, real prospects began to appear. Before the real breakthrough came, however, there was a detour. Carpenter briefly stepped into the world of television, hired by Warner Brothers in 1976 to write a thriller called High Rise. Originally, Carpenter had written it as a feature film, a tight, suspenseful story about a woman being stalked by an unseen predator. But Warner decided they wanted a TV movie instead, with one important catch: Carpenter would get a chance to direct. The project was retitled Someone's Watching Me. Carpenter enthusiastically accepted the job. It was his first true professional directing gig inside the system. 15 days of shooting, small budget, less control. For the first time, Carpenter had to work inside someone else's box. The movie was shot in standard television framing, the cramped aspect ratio he disliked. No Panavision canvas to stretch across, no wide horizontal spaces to haunt. Carpenter didn't compose the score either. Warner assigned veteran composer Harry Suckman handled the music. It sounded fine, but it didn't sound like Carpenter. The film is a strange experience. It doesn't look like a John Carpenter movie, it doesn't sound like a John Carpenter movie, and yet, somehow, it feels like a John Carpenter movie. The slow tension, the clean, simple visual storytelling, the deliberate pacing, the early use of POV camera shots to put the audience inside the stalker's mind. Even under constraints, even without his full toolbox, the Carpenter's signature was starting to emerge. The movie aired in late 1978. It earned solid ratings and praised for its slick, stylish approach, rare for TV thriller at the time. But for Carpenter, it confirmed something deeper. He could work under restrictions if he had to, but he didn't want to. He preferred his own way, the independent way. Someone's Watching Me also marked the beginning of something more personal. It was here that Carpenter met Adrienne Barbeau, an actress who would soon become a central figure not just in his work but in his life. At the time, Carpenter was still living with Deborah Hill. They had built a life together, personally and professionally. But with Adrienne, something different was beginning to stir. From the very first day, there was a spark, something undeniable between them. They both tried to resist it, tried to pretend it wasn't happening, but it was. Late-night conversations, flowers, letters, a goodnight kiss that lingered longer than it should have. You know what I'm talking about. Eventually, Carpenter faced what he could no longer deny. He told Deborah the truth. He had fallen in love with someone else. Hill, with remarkable dignity and maturity, accepted it. The personal relationship ended, but the professional bond and their deep creative respect remained unbroken. When Carpenter confessed his feelings to Adrienne, she hesitated. She asked for time, and Carpenter, exhausted but quietly hopeful, gave her space, throwing himself into his next project while waiting to see what the future might hold. Some collaborators shape your career, some change your life. Adrienne Barbeau did both. She had a strength and presence that matched the kinds of stories he wanted to tell, embodying the kind of tough, independent characters Carpenter admired. Carpenter never truly loved television. The small boxy frame always felt like a prison to him. He loved that TV could bypass Hollywood's machinery, but he hated the limits of that tiny screen. From the very beginning, Carpenter dreamed wider. It started in his childhood when CinemaScope first rolled into American theaters in 1953. Movies like Forbidden Planet with their rich, wide compositions left a permanent mark on him. He fell in love with the vastness of it, the sense of depth, the way the foreground and the background could breathe together across a giant horizontal space. While legends like Hitchcock, John Ford and even Howard Hawks disliked anamorphic widescreen, Carpenter embraced it. Assault on Precinct 13 was shot with the Panavision Silent Reflex, or PSR, a heavy, older 35mm camera usually reserved for bigger productions. From that point on, he moved permanently to lighter gear, favoring the Panavision Panaflex system for its portability and flexibility. Paired with C-series anamorphic lenses, Carpenter could stretch tiny sets on suburban streets into mythic, sprawling landscapes. Now, anamorphic lenses work by optically squeezing a wide image onto a standard film frame. When stretched back out in post-production, the image regains its full 2.35:1 widescreen shape. They also leave behind unmistakable fingerprints, horizontal lens flares Carpenter loved, oval-shaped bokeh in the background, and distinctive edge distortions. Carpenter loved these quirks. Instead of hiding them, he embraced them, turning technical imperfections into atmosphere and suspense. He learned early that tension wasn't always about what the audience could see, it was about what they felt was lurking just beyond their focus. Anamorphic framing let him layer action, foreground events, background shadows inside a single, controlled shot. I bought one for this project, a cheap and cheerful Chinese one, but an anamorphic lens nonetheless. It's a really cool piece of kit, and most importantly, it allows me to do this. As his career went on, Carpenter remained loyal to Panavision systems. Panaflex Gold cameras for larger productions, utilizing their C-series and E-series lenses, sometimes turning to the super high-speed anamorphic lenses when night shoots or complex scenes demanded better low-light performance. When smoother motion was needed, Carpenter turned to the Panaglide, Panavision's version of the Steadicam, to execute ghost-like tracking shots that seemed to drift through haunted houses and lonely streets. Even in his lesser-known works, Carpenter's films almost always begin with a strong, cinematic opening sequence, trapping the audience early, setting emotional rules before a single word is spoken. On top of all the cinematic artistry, he really also liked cheap tricks and an occasional jump scare, which he believed were very effective when correctly and sparingly used. Carpenter was a deeply instinctive filmmaker. He trusted his gut, whether it came to casting actors or choosing camera angles. Unlike the meticulous approach of Hitchcock, Carpenter favored the looser, more spontaneous style of Howard Hawks. He would always arrive on set with a clear vision, but he remained open to inputs, ready to adapt if a new idea served the film. Control was important to him, crucial even, but he didn't believe in micromanaging actors. The more you scrutinize them, he once said, the more insecure they get, and the more insecure they get, the worse actors they become. His approach was to give the actors space, to let them find their rhythm on their own and step in gently only if they asked for help. In the story of John Carpenter's career, very few characters were as important as Deborah Hill. She started as a script supervisor and editor, but quickly proved herself as a creative partner Carpenter couldn't do without during his early career. Their relationship started out as romantic, but even after they broke up, the creative collaboration kept going, built on professionalism and deep respect. Without Deborah Hill, there would be no John Carpenter as we know him, and together they would create the film that would change horror forever. By late 1977, John Carpenter was still searching for his real breakthrough. It came almost by accident. A film distributor named Michael Myers, yes, really, introduced two producers, Mustafa Akkad and Irvin Yablans. Akkad had the money, Yablans had an idea. A horror movie about babysitters being stalked on Halloween night, with a boogeyman at its center. At first, Carpenter wasn't thrilled by the concept, but the more he thought about it, the more potential he saw. He agreed, but only under three conditions: full creative control, the right to compose the music, and no interference from moneymen. Yablans agreed. Akkad came on board to finance the project with a $300,000 budget. Carpenter accepted a small $10,000 salary with a share of the profits if the movie succeeded. The working title was The Babysitter Murders, but Carpenter and Deborah Hill changed it simply Halloween. Production was tight. The shoot lasted just 22 days. No overtime, no room for mistakes. And somehow there weren't any. Everything went smooth as silk. Every scene shot made it into the final film. Nothing was wasted. They wrote the screenplay in just 10 days. Carpenter later made a second pass to add the character of Dr. Loomis, part Captain Ahab, part Van Helsing, the Harbinger and the Hunter combined. Carpenter initially tried to cast Christopher Lee for Loomis, but when Lee turned it down, they turned to Donald Pleasence, a veteran actor whose daughter had liked Assault on Precinct 13 and encouraged him to work with Carpenter. At first, Pleasence seemed aloof, maybe even dismissive. Only later did Carpenter realize that Pleasence was testing him, probing to see if Carpenter truly had the passion to do what he was doing. Nancy Loomis and Charles Cyphers were given roles too. P.J. Soles, whom Carpenter had a bit of a crush on, and who can blame him, brought energy to the teenage cast. Carpenter and Hill loved Jamie Lee Curtis from the start, casting her in the lead. Finally, Carpenter's old friend Nick Castle donned the mask to become the Shape. And the every town in question would be called Haddonfield, after Hill's own hometown. Carpenter didn't want Michael Myers to feel human, he wanted him to feel inhuman. For the mask, Tommy Lee Wallace brought him two options, a creepy clown mask and a Captain Kirk mask from the local costume shop. They chose the Kirk mask, sanded it down, widened the eye holes and painted it pale blue-white. The result was eerily blank, a face without humanity, an echo of Ed Gein's lifeless trophies. Myers wasn't terrifying because he killed, he was terrifying because he had no motive, patient, relentless, waiting. The real horror in Halloween isn't gore, and there is very little of it. It's primal fear, the unknowable shape in the grass, the thing our ancient ancestors sensed, but these suburban teenagers had forgotten. Dr. Loomis didn't call Myers disturbed or damaged, he simply called him evil. The space between Laurie Strode and Michael Myers shrinks all through the film, like a noose tightening until their worlds collide. Thanks to Assault on Precinct 13's success in Europe, even the BBC sent a reporter to cover the production, a sign of the growing buzz around Carpenter's name abroad.
Doc Pleasance and the sheriff know that the first dreadful deed was done here, in this room, when the monster was a little boy of 6. Now he's a maniac killer of 20, and on the loose.
The small budget forced relentless creativity. They filmed in Pasadena during spring, hauling around bags of dead leaves to fake autumn. The crew multitasked constantly, Hill, Carpenter and Wallace filling whatever jobs needed doing, except when it came to cinematography. And that was because of Dean Cundey, who had climbed his way up through low-budget filmmaking, came aboard as cinematographer. It was Cundey who suggested using the Panaglide, and its smooth, ghost-like movement became Halloween's secret weapon. The camera didn't just observe the horror, it forced the audience to experience the fear from inside the killer's mind. The first cut of Halloween didn't impress executives. They said it wasn't scary. It didn't work. In just 3 days, Carpenter composed a score built around a strange off-kilter 5/4 rhythm his father had once taught him on bongos. Simple, off-balance, unsettling. 2 weeks later, Carpenter rescreened the film, now with music. This time the executives declared it was the scariest thing they had ever seen. When Halloween premiered on October 25, 1978 in Kansas City, it opened quietly. Critics mostly ignored it or dismissed it, until Tom Allen of The Village Voice praised it. Carefully, almost apologetically, but undeniably. Then came the ubiquitous Gene Siskel, then Roger Ebert, and The Dam Broke. It was okay for a critic to like it now. Halloween was intentionally released very slowly, simmering for a year, and when it returned to theaters with fresh marketing, it exploded. $50 million at the box office, eventually over $70 million worldwide. NBC even paid $3 million for the TV rights, an unheard of sum for an independent horror film. It became the most profitable independent movie of its time, a record it would hold for 2 decades until the Blair Witch Project went even further. Halloween permanently reshaped the landscape of horror. It opened the floodgates to a new subgenre. Just look at this list of movies released in the next few years riding the coattails of Halloween. Some consider Halloween the greatest horror movie ever made. Some think it's overrated. But love it or not, its impact was undeniable. And Carpenter and Hill didn't just make a hit, and Carpenter didn't just become a loved horror director. They didn't just make a movie that made money, they made something that made lots and lots of money. And with that, they had made John Carpenter a prospect for Hollywood.